Welcome, participants, to our question and answer session following these wonderful, thought-provoking presentations by Dr. Kassam and Dr. Kaemingk. Dr. Kassam, I'm going to give you an opportunity before we entertain questions to respond to Dr. Kaemink's presentation, because I know he had some questions at the end there that I could see that you might want to respond to. But I'll take just a moment to summarize, to give you a chance to prepare. To summarize some of what hit me about both of your presentations. So Dr. Kassam talked about the racialization of Muslims, even though the Muslim faith is one of the most diverse faiths in the world. And she put that in the context of racism in the United States. And she talked about how population racism treats a whole community of people with fear and monitors them and excludes them. She also talked about what's been happening to refugees under this administration, both in terms of the limitation on total numbers, but also in terms of the particular exclusion of Muslim refugees. She then talked about the power of interfaith collaboration to support, heal, and give hope. Dr. Kaemingk talked about in this interfaith collaboration, the power of embodied contact to form citizens, particularly at critical moments when there are new opportunities that arise, and how important this is for pluralism and democracy. And then he asked questions around theology, that where is God in all of this? And can that impact our motivations beyond fear and reaction? And then particularly with looking at the example of the Black church, how were they capable of doing this in the civil rights movement? And then what does this say to the growing power of the growing threat, the growing challenge, the growing power of individualism in our society? How do we deal with that? So that's my little, summary. Dr. Kassam, I want to open up to you if there are ways that you would like to respond to what Dr. Kaemingk said.
Thank you very much. I really, really appreciated the insightful reading that you gave my work and the really, I guess, targeted questions that you asked, because, that's the kind of thing that really enriches this conversation. I don't quite know where to begin with how to address them. Because you raised so many important points. Let me just begin with one that really struck me deeply when you said that there was no mention of God really in any of this work, that and the thinking that people were reporting when I asked them why they were engaging in this kind of work. And I just want to bring you all back to, that founding question that Pastor Adam asked, which is, what does it mean to love my neighbor? Now, that is a scriptural text, as you know, there's a commandment to love thy neighbor. So my sense was that God was very much, and God in the form of Jesus, or, however the Jewish congregations, conceptualize and understand God, was very much present in everything that people did. In the sense that, to me, it seemed to be an embodiment. We talk about imitatio Christi, for example, right? So it was an embodiment of the values that they felt were most palpable and most significant to them as part of their overall religiosity and their commitment to their faith and their attempts to embody their faiths as much as they possibly could, right? So to me, the theology is very palpably present. So that's one thing that I think that I should say right off the bat, that God is present by the absence, in that the presence is made palpable through the enactment of the values. And you mentioned that in your remarks as well. So that was one thing. Then the second thing, one of the things you mentioned, and again, I find this also a conundrum myself, that, there has been, I think for decades now, or at least since the 80s, 70s, 80s, 90s, there is this great fear that organized religion is actually on its way out. That, churches are not filling their pews, synagogues are not filling their benches with young people. That youth ministry is even more significant now, even more important now, because once we lose the youth, then, this becomes a generation of old people that are essentially keeping organized religion alive. And I think that to some extent, to me, it seems that these fears are unfounded, only because I think each generation discovers for itself anew what kind of relationality and relationship they want with the faith traditions into which they were born. So, they might ignore it. They might be forced to go to Saturday or Sunday school. They may not come, they may just go for funerals and, high holy days and for weddings and births. But something seems to me something that happens, I think, to me, seems to be that the older they get, and once they've found who they themselves are and recognized what their values are, they may or may not turn to official attendance in their organized religious traditions, depending on what their needs and circumstances are. So for many people, it happens, when they start having children of their own, because then they realize that they want to give their children a sense of community, a sense of values. And so then they start being church going or synagogue going again. Do you see what I mean? So that's one thing. So I think that, the reasons for which a person is drawn to their faith tradition develop and change over the course of their life, and they participate in it when they can. Now, having said that, one of the things that struck me as I was investigating and doing this research is that people already, as human beings, felt a sense of unease with the current political establishment. They felt a sense of unease with racism and Islamophobia, right? And what the refugee work allowed them to do was actually to bring the different things that they felt uneasy about with their values, with whatever opportunities their organized traditions afforded them, to coalesce them, to bring them all together in order to do the work that they did. So I would like to actually disassociate the causal relationship between, first I felt a sense of unease with the political administration, or first I felt, a sense of unease at the racism that was so blatant, or first there was the organized religion, or first there were my values, but rather I think it was the kind of coming together of all of these together that allowed for the community organizing to happen, for the robust engagement with refugees, with the attempt to fundraise, with the bringing together the resources, both capital as well as intellectual and, know-how resources of the people that were engaged. All of these kind of come together. So it was, I think, a coming together of different elements rather than a direct causal relationship. Do you see what I mean? So I think that the future of American democracy doesn't necessarily depend on there being clear causal pathways as much as it depends on thinking people with values wanting to do something about situations that they think are unethical and untenable.
Well, very powerful. And I know that we could just keep going like this, but then I have a list of questions here too.
Sure,
so
that's
let
fine.
me
But
jump into the questions, and maybe Dr. Kaemingk, you'll have a chance to include some of your responses in these questions. Actually, the first question really is more to Dr. Kaemingk, although I would love Dr. Kassam to have you respond as well. It's much more about how Christians can participate with integrity in interfaith contexts. And this is how the person phrases it. As far as they might conflict, what is the balance between our valuation of relationship and our valuation of holding to the truth of Christ when connecting with Muslims or people of Muslim background? So I think that goes to you first, Dr. Kaemingk.
Okay, wonderful. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. How do these things, our valuing of relationship and our valuing of Christian identity?
Because the truth of Christ was how this person phrased it.
Sure. Well, I would just say that these things are not in conflict and they're not in tension, but our relationship with Jesus Christ requires our hospitality and friendship for those who are different from us. So it's not as if we have a balance here of deep conviction for Christ and civility and love for others, but it's actually that our identity within Christ demands a life of hospitality, love, and sacrifice for the other. And so, yeah, I would just orient things that way so that, the cross itself, which is the center of Christian identity, offers us an image of a costly hospitality, not only to those who are like me, but those who are different from me, and even those that I might see as potentially hostile to me. The cross, which is at the center of our faith, gives us an image of hospitality that is a costly one. It's not a cheap one. It's not a thin picture of tolerance. It's not a bumper sticker of coexist. It's an embodied sacrifice for the other. It's a vulnerable hand that's outstretched. I wouldn't put those things in tension of convictions over here and hospitality over here.
Dr. Kassam, I would just love to know how it feels when you're the other that's being talked about here, and what do you think of it?
Well, I think this is what was so amazing to see, that I won't speak for the Jewish participants, but certainly for the Christian participants, it seemed to me like they were seeing the face of Jesus in the other. Mm-hmm. And that is a remarkable kind of, if you want to think about how interfaith relations work, because we're so used to this idea that really it is, my prime mission in life to convert everyone to my faith. But I didn't see any evidence of that. But rather it was a meeting of, oh my goodness, the values that we have are mirrored in the values that the other is also bringing to the table. And there are theological differences. There are differences in how we conceptualize, what it means to be religious, or what it means to sort of like subscribe to a particular tradition. But the firmness of faith and the desire to be the best human being you can be, that is accountable to a larger divine power, that I think is where people found resonances. They saw resonances of their own faith in each other, right? Because, of course, Muslims have a tremendously deep tradition of hospitality and generosity. And so, one of the delightful things and things I would hear constantly is, oh my gosh, we can never go and visit them without being invited to sit down and share a cup of chai and, partake of this meal. So just the partaking of the meal, like, doesn't matter how straitened the circumstances are, the hospitality was so palpably present, right? So yes, I think that what Professor Kaemingk says is really borne out here, that it really was a kind of embodiment of one's own values that drove the work, but also drove the reception.
Beautifully said. Thank you both.
Yeah.
The next question is a little difficult for me to actually speak because of some of the assumptions that are in it, but I still think it's very important for both of you to respond to it. How can Christians share visions of hope for hosts and migrants in light of the latest attack in France? How do we make a stand against evil without facilitating scapegoating? I saw, I was a little flooded by it, but so I can repeat it if you are also that way.
Please repeat it.
How can Christians share visions of hope for hosts and migrants in light of the latest attack in France? How do we make a stand against evil without facilitating scapegoating?
So I guess, because what happened was a person was beheaded because that teacher showed the cartoons, the Danish cartoons that discredited Muhammad, who is prophet. And that, of course, has sent, shockwaves through. So I guess, obviously I don't speak for all Muslims, but certainly killing somebody is not a Muslim value. It is not, There's a line in the Quran that says, when you save one human life, it's like you saved all of humanity. When you kill one human life, it's like you kill all of humanity, right? So killing is not something that's an Islamic value, right? So then I guess the question that one has to ask is that what motivates someone to kill someone who has discredited their prophet, right? And you can only think that, okay, the best interpretation I can give to this is that they felt the moral injury, as did all Muslims, when their prophet was caricatured in this manner and insulted in this manner. So there is a sense of moral injury. And it's valid for people to feel that sense of moral injury. But that moral injury is not healed by killing someone, right? It can be healed through an apology. It can be healed through an understanding that, this is not a good civil thing to do, but not through killing someone. So, Muslims, there are many Muslims who are as aghast at what went down in France as, people who are not Muslim.
Yeah.
I'll stop there.
Yeah, so many things to be said. As far as sharing visions of hope, I think what Professor Kassam has done in her paper is one of those things in terms of sharing narratives of embodied action. And the narratives of the news media are these, right? And the narratives that are not shared are those that we've heard today of embodied interaction and hospitality and the transformation that happens because of those. And so the great things that we can do are share those stories. And a couple of years ago, I published this book on Muslim immigration and Christian hospitality. And in that book, you can buy it on Amazon. In that book, I share several stories of Christian responses to moments like what happened in France. So the moment something like that happens, there are Pentecostal pastors in Europe who will encircle a mosque and guard it to make sure that it's not burned or defaced. Sharing stories of Muslim and Christian women sewing together, of Christian pastors and Muslims eating together and having conversations, of a jobs program that is developed and executed by Muslims and Christians together. The small and large ways in which Christians and Muslims respond to these kinds of things, and also sharing the stories, frankly, of Muslim Americans who serve in our military and in our police force, who protect us every single day. There are Muslims here in America who protect us and serve us and care for us in hospitals and employ us in the economy. And those stories are not shared because what we like to do is we like to frame Muslims in one-dimensional ways that can be clearly understood. So we want to frame Muslims as a problem to be solved, a question to be answered, a project to be fulfilled, rather than three-dimensional human beings made in the image of God who have stories and bodies and communities and lives. So in response, storytelling and embodied engagement are the best way to respond to tragedies like what happened in France.
Thank you so much. The next question takes us in a very different direction, and it's for Dr. Kassam. Since your expertise is also in feminism, could you say something about the issues from that perspective as well?
I'm not sure what issues are being meant here. I know that certainly connecting it to migration, one of the early kind of encounter issues that the host organizations and people were encountering was, are there things we need to be careful about? Like, should we not shake hands with if I'm a woman, should I not shake hands with the Muslim or the Syrian male? Or, is there something about men and women having to be separated from each other? And, so they were worried about, what are some of the practices and cultural kind of codes that we will need to navigate when dealing with gender issues. And on the other side, it was kind of refreshing to see that, mostly the Syrian, but there are also some Afghan, some Iraqi, they just behaved as they normally would, in the sense that those who wanted to wear a hijab wore the hijab, those who wanted to come and sit in spaces that were mixed gender audiences or, spaces would do so, others wouldn't. Some would speak up regardless of who was in the room, others wouldn't. And so I think that people began to see that really you take your cues from how they're offered, and if boundaries are crossed, then it's done in a spirit of generosity. That people were generous with each other, and they would explain that, we don't do it this way, we do it this way, if that's okay with you. It wasn't sort of like done in ways that made people feel uncomfortable. And, people learned very quickly to put their hands on their heart and sort of bow to say hello if it was mixed gender, where they realized that, okay, the other gender is not really comfortable with my putting my hand out and, shaking hands. So that was the kind of grammar of negotiating difference without discriminating and insisting that you be exactly the same as I am, right? And then the other really interesting thing that happened is that, especially this one family, the Kanjos, he couldn't find work. She, on the other hand, Claremont Canopy helped to start an organization that actually cooks food. So she's a businesswoman now. So this is a very strong gender role to have, right? And she's now the main income earner. And then, of course, the husband and the family are all doing it together. So, that didn't last for too long, and it's shared work. But it's so interesting to see the women thriving in ways that the American kind of context allows for them to do, when every single thing that you could think of was against them, not having English, not having education, not having, a skill set apart from what you do in the home. How all of this kind of came together to work towards us feeling in a state of grace, if you know what I mean, with the entire community helping to make it happen.
Thank you. It looks like Dr. Kaemingk, you would like to respond to this as well?
Yes, just brief comment. Those were wonderful comments, but just that when it comes to Westerners interacting with Muslim women, we just always have to be careful that Westerners have a tendency to look upon Muslim women as weak, as oppressed, as sort of in need of liberation and salvation, as if they are in need of our saving or our education or our liberating work. And so we see the hijab as often we interpret it as shackles, or as something that's oppressing them or keeping them down. And it's just very important to be mindful of those dangers when we're interacting with Muslim women and interpreting their dress.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a series of questions here that are practical. Some of them are Los Angeles focused, but I always like to broaden it beyond Los Angeles because I think they are larger questions. So there's 4 of them. The first one is really for you, Dr. Kassam, but maybe Dr. Kaemingk has some knowledge here as well, which is how are the mosques involved in responding to the needs of refugees in this state? What is the ministry of the mosques to the refugee community?
So the mosque, it's actually located right at the boundary of Pomona and Claremont. And the mosque got involved very early. They found that there were actually many, many Muslims who wanted to do things like donate to a fund that would help meet some of the material needs of the congregants, of the arriving refugee families. And so they got together and they decided that, okay, one thing that we need to do is to deal with transport issues. So they worked with other dealers in the maybe Muslim-owned dealerships, I don't know, car dealerships, to get cars to the families that were arriving, right? So that was one thing that they did. The other thing they did was that they utilized their networks so that there would be employment for some of the people who arrived, especially when you think that, several of the families that arrived actually didn't know languages other than Arabic. Obviously there's a high learning curve when you have to learn a whole entire language. Well, how do you make a living? Because you can't very well drive an Uber or Lyft because you need to be able to read English, even if you're following, sort of GPS kind of thing. So they found jobs in, places for them that didn't necessarily require language skills, but could be behind the scenes work. The third thing they did was that they opened up the mosque space, social rooms, where students from the Claremont colleges could go every evening from 5 in the evening or sometimes 3 in the afternoon after school got out, right up to 10 at night, so that older faculty members could come to help with English. So Claremont College students would help, K through 12 students with their homework, and many of the students at the Claremont colleges were actually taking classes in Arabic. But then they would help the older members, with reading English, with pronouncing English, with, mock conversations, like if you wanted to go to a barber, how would you do it? If you wanted to go to a bank and open an account, how would you do that? So the mosque provided the space for that, right? And then they also participated in fundraising efforts, things like that, right?
Well, thank you very much. That was a very clear picture. I think the next 2 questions go together, and I think they start with Dr. Kaemingk, and then I think Dr. Kassam may have some comments. So the 2 questions are, did general American views of Muslims cause any hindrance to the ministry to Muslims in the Los Angeles area? But it's a larger question as well. What is one practical way for a Christian to engage a Muslim neighbor in hostile climates? So both of these talk about the hostile climate right now and how that impacts and how we deal with that.
I think Professor Kassam could speak specifically to what's going on in Los Angeles as far as these things go. I would say that the growing Islamophobia since 9/11, and then I would say 2016 was a massive uptick as well, has forced Christians to take sides, where before Christians could largely ignore the issue of Islamophobia. Now they're being a bit more forced to make decisions about how they're going to interact with their Muslim neighbor. And I think that what is really exciting to see is when a church, when a congregation can get to that point where they no longer see the mosque across the street as a problem to be solved or an issue to be handled, but as an opportunity for them to grow in their faith, an opportunity for them to learn new things about their faith. And maybe I'll close by just talking about my own relationship with a dear Muslim friend named Shadi Hamid, who took it upon himself to read the Christian book of Galatians. He was very interested in learning more about Christianity, and he said, "Matt, I read the book of Galatians," which for Christians, we know it's a lot about the concepts of law and grace. And he was confused in a wonderful way about this concept of grace and what it meant. And so Shadi and I shared a meal, and over that meal, I had to find a way to communicate what grace had meant to me. And I must say that I go to church every week and I pray every day. And that meal with Shadi was the most powerful spiritual experience that I had had that entire year, because I was forced as a Christian to reflect anew on what grace really means to me, and how I don't actually have the words to express the beauty of what God's grace means to me. So there at that table, my interaction with Shadi was not that he had a question that I needed to answer, or that he was a problem that I needed to solve, but that meal was an opportunity for me to grow in deeper love of my Savior, Jesus Christ. And that interaction grew me personally. And I think that this moment of growing Islamophobia, whether that be racist or anti-religionist, needs to be embraced by the Christian faith, not as a problem, but as an opportunity for us to remember again what the hospitality of God is all about, for us personally, but also for our public lives with people who are different, to remember what Jesus has done for us, and then to ask ourselves, what kind of life has Jesus purchased us for? So his hospitality has bought me for something. And our interaction with our Muslim neighbors, for those of us who have grown sleepy in the faith, is an opportunity to wake up to what that faith is all about. So I think that's where my mind goes. I'd kind of close with that, I guess.
We only have 2 more minutes and I have to make an announcement. So very quick answer, Dr. Kassam. I think that one of the assumptions in this question is that maybe people who are experiencing being hated might not want to work with people who seem similar to the people that hate them. That from the Muslim side, there might be a little resistance to working with Christians at this moment. And how would you respond to that?
I think there's 2 things I'd like to say. Number one, that, one cannot assume that every Syrian or Iraqi one meets is actually Muslim. So because there are such a high number of Christian Iraqis and Syrians that have come in as among the refugee banner, right? What this does is that it compounds the fact that people's racist assumptions will put a Christian in that racist place. Does that make sense? Do you understand what I'm saying? That you can see an Egyptian and think, oh, these bloody Muslims, or excuse my language, whatever. But that person may well be a Christian. So this is where one's racist assumptions have constantly got to be checked at the door, because you don't actually know what faith that person is. That's the one thing. The second thing is that, when you think of the fact that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam share so much more than they differ on, that really, in a sense, the field is wide open for making collaborations across our differences, such as they are, because there's so much more that we share, including the one God, right? So, in a sense, this is like a kaleidoscope of the same thing. It's a refracted version of something that is very deeply rooted in all of us. I think that's where I'll stop. But yeah.
Thank you so much, both of you. This has been so rich and so beautiful.